All right, thank you, Dominic. I'm just going to share my screen here. Bear with me. Okay. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate that. And I am going to talk about airspace today. Okay, so a little bit on controlled versus uncontrolled. This might be good information for a new UAS operator or even a new private pilot or recreational pilot. And we're going to focus specifically on Class E airspace, which is a little bit different, especially when it comes to UAS operations. So that's our goal today. My background is I'm a commercial pilot, certified flight instructor, and I was a graduate of Daniel Webster College back in the day. And I worked in aviation, commercial aviation operations, and then I went to work for the state of New Hampshire as a safety inspector and aviation planner. At that time, I had, they gave the new person, right? They always give the new person some little job. And in that case, it was UAS. There was a little piece that was starting to pop up, and that was unmanned aircraft. So of course the new guy got that piece, right? 4 years later, that little piece was about a third of what I did every day. So I found it very, very interesting, as unmanned aircraft are now this new piece of aviation, and we haven't had a real new piece of aviation in 50 years. So I found it really, really interesting of how they're starting to integrate UAS, the regulations that go along with it. And I came to work for a UAS company here in New Hampshire. So we're based here in Concord, and ArgenTech is a UAS services provider. Worldwide, we focus mostly on defense and Department of Interior contracts, wildfire monitoring, emergency response, and we have about 50 of our remote pilots are actually embedded with our military and NATO troops across the globe. So that's what we really specialize in. But today, you lucky ducks, we're going to talk about airspace. Okay, so the first half of this presentation, we're going to talk about the differences between controlled airspace and uncontrolled, and why it's important to you as a UAS operator. I'm talking on behalf today I am a FAA Fast Team Drone Pro rep for Maine and New Hampshire. So this is going to be fast specific. So it's going to focus a lot on safety and understanding the differences. But it's also going to focus a lot on the UAS operator. It doesn't mean that it's not really good information for everyone to have, but I'll be referring to UAS operations quite a bit in this presentation. Okay, so let's get started. What are we going to learn in this presentation? We're going to learn about we're going to learn why the FAA regulates airspace, the different classifications of airspace, and then also when you need an airspace authorization as a UAS operator. Okay, so airspace, it's important to know, and it's important to remember that when you're flying your drone, you're sharing the airspace with corporate jets, helicopters, commercial airliners, and thousands of private aircraft, okay? And they're operating out of one of probably I think there's 5,000 public airports that are registered in the United States. Now, public airports are airports that are open to the public, okay? There are many, many, many more privately owned airports in the country. So to put this in perspective, the state of New Hampshire has over 140 registered helipads, airports, and seaplane bases. Out of that 140, only 24 of those are public, open to the public. Okay, so I mean, just in New Hampshire, small little New Hampshire, put that in perspective for you. Okay, so there could be a grass strip in in somebody's backyard that is private, and you don't necessarily know it's there, and it may not even be charted, but the airport is actually there. So those are kind of things that we want to keep in mind when we think about where airports are located and the traffic that's associated with them. Many of these parts of the country also have like extensive military operations. And we all know that in the MOAs, the military operating areas, you can have low level, high speed flying. New Hampshire, I'm going to focus on New Hampshire a lot, obviously. New Hampshire has 2 military operating areas up north that are frequently used, and they don't have to be activated to be used, just so you know. If you've ever been up north and you've seen 2 or 3 C-130s flying in tandem, you know, through one of the low-level valleys or something, you can understand how awesome that is, but how also disconcerting it can be to a UAS operator that's operating at low altitude because they're operating in the same area as you are. Okay, so the potential for aircraft collisions is not as remote as you might think. And every day the FAA receives reports where pilots of manned aircraft observe a drone that was either too close, too high, or operating in an area which caused an unnecessary increase in risk. Sometimes it's easy to think that you'll be able to see and avoid airplanes in your area, but even in a manned aircraft who has, you know, a better visual vantage point, it's sometimes really difficult to see traffic in your area. Another difficulty is the possibility to misjudge the altitude of either your aircraft or the aircraft that is in your area. So you may think that you're flying at a height that won't interfere with an aircraft, but it's really difficult to be certain. So Part 107 states that, Part 107 is the UAS regulations, the FAA regulations. Part 107 states that UAS operations are not to interfere with manned aircraft operations. So if interference is even a remote possibility, it's always best to decrease your altitude, relocate your UAS to a safe location, and just wait for that manned aircraft to pass through the area or land, whatever they're doing. And you want to remember that aircraft may be flying lower than you think. So I've talked to a lot of UAS operators who think that all aircraft are mandated to fly at least above 500 feet. That's not true. That's not a regulation. It's a suggestion. But the regulation actually doesn't say that you have to operate at 500 feet. It's any altitude that the pilot deems safe if there was an emergency that they could land the aircraft safely. And a lot of, you know, emergency or patrol aircraft, crop dusters, they're going to fly lower than 400 feet on a routine basis. Okay, so most drone flying is limited to 400 feet. Okay, that's Part 107. They limit us to 400 feet. The FAA selected 400 feet as the maximum altitude for flying drones because the FAA reviewed considerable input from the industry and different organizations, private individuals who were flying, and they found that before they published Part 107, that 400 feet is an altitude that allows for a majority of UAS operations to be conducted while still providing a margin of safety for most manned aircraft. Now, again, I said, you know, most of them are going to be flying at 500 feet. That is not mandated. They don't have to fly at 500 feet. So it's a little false security for some drone operators that don't understand that about manned aviation. Okay. So to help decrease the risk of aircraft conflicting with one another, the FAA has segregated airspace into different categories. The two that we're focusing on in this first half of the presentation are controlled and uncontrolled airspace. Two of the most misunderstood terms regarding airspace are controlled and uncontrolled. Okay, but generic terms the FAA uses to describe certain responsibilities and services provided by air traffic control. And we're going to touch on that more in a bit. So first, let's look at air traffic control's role in regulating the airspace. Air traffic control's primary purpose is to prevent collisions between aircraft and organize and expedite the flow of aircraft. Okay, the requirements to get an authorization to fly your drone in controlled airspace provides air traffic visibility into your planned flight. So in order to fulfill their role, air traffic must be aware of your UAS operations and all the manned aircraft operations in their airspace at all times. Now, it's important to note that based on higher priorities or other circumstances, authorization from air traffic might not always be granted. And this is true for unmanned and manned aircraft, but priority for authorization is always going to be given to manned aircraft in these situations. Okay, airspace in which air traffic control services are provided are controlled airspace. So Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo are all controlled airspace. This includes drone operators. So they need to be aware of how the FAA has segmented off controlled airspace. And again, these are the 5 segments of or classes of airspace. But generally speaking, a UAS operator has to receive authorization from air traffic before flying in controlled airspace. It's not 100% accurate. That statement is not 100% accurate, and I'm going to explain that to you in a second. But it's a really good rule to make sure that you're double checking your flight planning and the permissions required if you're going to be flying in controlled airspace. You should just assume that in controlled airspace, you're going to need an authorization. And again, there's always exceptions to the rules, so we'll discuss that in a second. Okay, so before you fly, it's important to know what requirements you as a drone pilot are required to meet. The US airspace is the safest airspace in the world, and safely integrating drones requires that all UAS operators understand and comply with those rules. And I know that's hard because it's a very difficult job, because you can buy a drone, technically you can buy a drone in a gas station, right? So to try and educate all of these people that are operating UAS is extremely difficult right now. If you plan to fly in controlled airspace, you generally have to get approval from the FAA to do so. And I'm going to give you an example of when you don't have to in the second half of this presentation. If you do need permission, the permission is known as an airspace authorization. So not a waiver. There's a difference between an airspace authorization and an airspace waiver. And the airspace authorizations can only be issued by air traffic. Okay, so regardless of how the authorization application is submitted, if it's done through a land service provider or drone zone, an airspace authorization can only come from air traffic. Now, to tag on to that, but going off topic just a touch, if you need an operational waiver for UAS operations or deviation from Part 107 that pertain to operations, not airspace, that is submitted always through the FAA drone zone, which is the portal. And it's approved by the UAS safety team at FAA headquarters. Okay, so airspace and operational waivers are 2 separate things, 2 separate authorizations, and they are actually vetted by 2 separate FAA entities. I could talk all day on airspace waivers and authorizations, so if anybody ever has any questions about that, I'll put my email into the chat box and we can chat about waivers all day, okay? Just not during this presentation. Okay. So let's see. All right. So talks about controlled airspace. Let's focus on uncontrolled airspace, otherwise known as Class G or Class Gulf airspace for a second. And I love the definition of Class G airspace. G airspace is defined as any airspace not categorized as A, B, C, D, or E. Okay, that's pretty simple, right? All encompassing, pretty simple. We can remember that. We use the term uncontrolled because air traffic control, from an air traffic control standpoint, they are not responsible for separating aircraft in those areas. Some people assume that uncontrolled means something like a free-for-all. That's really incorrect. There's still rules and regulations which apply to all aircraft, manned and unmanned, operating in this airspace. It's just that these rules and regulations that ensure aircraft do not conflict with each other are on the onus of the pilot or on the operator at that time. So typically Class Gulf airspace begins at the surface and extends upward to the next airspace layer, which can vary depending on where you're operating. And the next airspace layer is normally Echo, because Class Echo can begin at different altitudes depending on air traffic's needs. It's important to know where Class Echo begins in your area, and you can do that a couple different ways, looking at the sectional or the Lance chart for UAS operators. So for operations in uncontrolled airspace, air traffic authorization is not needed. However, there are still rules and regulations for operating in Class G airspace. Now, controlled and uncontrolled, okay? So now we're gonna get directly into Class E airspace, which is kind of what I wanted to focus on. I just wanted to touch on controlled versus uncontrolled so you can see the difference between Class G and Class E and how those airspaces, they bump up next to each other. quite often, so it can get confusing on where they start and what permissions that you need. So I'm going to try to help clarify that right now by going into some specific details on Class E airspace. Okay. So it may seem pretty straightforward how Class E airspace is designated, but it can be confusing for manned and unmanned pilots. And I will tell you that when I started researching Class E airspace, do not feel bad if you don't understand it, even if you've been operating for 20 years as a manned pilot. I'm not saying that was my specific example, but don't feel bad if you don't know that there was even differences in Class E2, 3, 4, 2, 3, and 4, because I didn't know that, and I've been flying for many years. I actually even know several air traffic controllers who didn't know that there was a difference between E2, 3, and 4. So do not feel bad. We're going to go over this in detail. Okay. We're going to talk about the different types, how they affect your drone operation, how to spot them on an aeronautical chart, and which one you need FAA authorization to operate in. Okay, so Class E airspace generally begins where Class Golf ends. We talked about that. And that usually varies between 700 feet and 1,200 feet AGL, or it starts at the surface. So Class E can start at the surface, especially when it's designated to an airport surface. Okay, so Class Echo airspace is not associated with an airport surface. Under Part 107 regulations, if it's not designated to an airport, you can operate in Class E, which is controlled airspace, without an FAA authorization. Okay, I'm going to clarify that in a second. All right, so Class E airspace begins at 1,200 feet AGL, unless otherwise shown. When Class Echo begins at 700 feet, it's indicated by a magenta shaded ring, right? So, and that's usually surrounding an airport. Now you might be wondering why you need to know about Class Echo airspace that starts at 700 feet or 1,200 feet when most drone flights are limited to 400 feet. Great question, thank you for asking. So the FAA small UAS rule under Part 107, it's 51B for those who want the specifics. They allow for drone flights to fly higher than 400 feet AGL in certain situations. So if you're operating within a 400-foot radius of a structure, you can fly to the structure's uppermost limit plus an additional 400 feet. I'm going to give you a minute for that to sink in. The diagram helps. So if you're within 400 feet of a structure, you can fly up to 400 feet above that structure. And they did this because they wanted people to be able to inspect things like cell phone towers and windmills. Okay, so consider the example structure shown here. You can fly to a maximum altitude of 1,865 feet AGL as long as you comply with all other parts of Part 107, such as, maintaining visual line of sight. So in this example, flying at 1,865 feet means that you're operating in Class Echo airspace, but it's not Class Echo that's designated or in association with an airport. So in this case, you do not have to have an airspace authorization to operate. Okay. Let's take a look at another type of Class Echo airspace, which is surface class Echo. So this type of airspace causes the most confusion. The regulations clearly state that operations within the lateral boundaries of the surface area of Class Echo airspace designated for an airport require an airspace authorization. So what is surface class Echo airspace, and how do we know when it's designated for an airport? Again, great question. Thanks for asking. Simply put, Class Echo airspace is extended down to the surface instead of starting at 700 or 1,200 feet. Okay, so it's very descriptive in its name. So surface class Echo starts at the surface. This category of airspace exists to add additional protections to arriving and departing aircraft. Because of this, certain portions of Class Echo or Surface Class Echo airspace require authorization prior to flight. And we're going to talk about the 3 types of Surface Class Echo airspace: Echo 4, Echo 3, and Echo 2. Of these, only Echo 2 requires an airspace authorization. So through the next few slides, I'm going to walk you through the different types and show you how you can easily identify which type is in your area. We're going to start with Class Echo extensions. So you guys have seen these on a sectional chart. They're usually designated for bad weather or approaches into an airport, right? They're put there to help control the airspace to a lower altitude. Okay, so if the airspace is Class G up to 1,200 feet, the air traffic did not think that that was sufficient. They want to control the airspace, especially in bad weather, down to the surface for safety purposes. Okay, so we're going to start with Class Echo extensions. Like I said, they exist to allow manned aircraft to make safe approaches to runways in bad weather. Class Echo 4 and Echo 3 do not require air traffic authorization for you to fly in them, but Echo 2 does. So how do we know the difference between Echo 3, 4, 3, and 2? Okay, so Echo 4 is an extension to Class Delta or Surface Class Echo airspace. Great example of this, Lebanon, Nashua, Portsmouth, okay? Those 3. So I've highlighted green and red areas to help clarify what I'm going to talk about. The aeronautical chart shown as an Echo 4 extension is in the green shaded area. The key to recognizing this as an Echo 4 extension is the magenta dashed line that segregates the green shaded area from the red shaded area. Echo 4 extensions do not require air traffic authorizations. Another example of Echo 4 airspace extension, again, the green shaded area represents the Echo 4 area, while the red shaded area in this image signifies a Class Delta airport, meaning it has an operational control tower. Sorry, that would be Pease, Lebanon, and Nashua. Okay. The previous example, the key information is the segregating line, this time a dashed blue line that segregates Class Delta airspace from the Echo 4 area. As I mentioned in the previous slide, operations in Echo 4 airspace do not require an airspace authorization. Here's an example of an Echo 3 extension. Echo 3 extensions are associated with Class Charlie airspace like Manchester. Okay, so like Echo 4, Echo 3 extensions are segregated from the adjacent airspace. In this case, because the adjacent airspace is Class Charlie, a solid magenta line is used. And like Echo 4, operations in Echo 3 airspace do not require an airspace authorization. All right, so Echo 2. This is the one that you need airspace authorization for. Now, sometimes the extensions are not segregated from Echo 2. In this example, you can see that there's no lines, dashed or solid, segregating the airspace. An example of this is Concord Airport. Okay, in this case, the entire area requires FAA authorization prior to flight. So Echo 2 airspace, including the Echo 2 extensions, require you to obtain an ATC authorization through LANC or drone zone before you fly in that area. Okay, easy, right? We got this. Okay, so if you're new to the drone community and you find aeronautical charts confusing, don't worry, everyone does. The UAS Facility Maps can be a really great resource for helping you understand when you would need an airspace authorization. In this area, if you'd like to operate, it requires an airspace authorization. There'll be a grid map associated with it. So if some of the manned pilots might not have seen this, but this is a grid map. This is a facility map that the FAA put together with air traffic to designate the area around airports to make it easier to approve UAS operations in the vicinity of airports. Okay, so for example, in this chart, if you look at it, there's several, in the grids, there's numbers designated in that grid. a UAS operator can apply for, you still have to have permission, you still have to get an authorization, but what they've done is simplified the process. So through, there's usually an app that you can use, or you can do it on your computer. But if you want to fly in one of the areas that says 100 feet, that's the upper limit to what air traffic wants you to fly. So if you want to fly 100 feet and below, you can put a request in through a LANC provider, whatever your choice is, and request to operate in that area. If it's 100 feet and below, you should receive almost instant notification that your operation has been approved, as long as it complies with all other Part 107 regulations. You'll receive instant notification. If you want to fly above 100 feet, so if you want to fly 101 feet, you still have to apply for authorization to fly in that area, but you will not receive instant notification or almost instant notification that your request has been approved. And the reason is that these grids were created by air traffic saying, if you fly at 100 feet in that area, you really are not going to be a factor to us at all, for reasons, whatever they are. Either there's already obstructions that go up to 100 feet, or the approaches aren't in that direction, or whatever it is. But air traffic has already deemed that area below 100 feet safe for UAS operations to happen. You still have to get your permission to operate in that area, but it's an instant notification that you have that permission. If you want to fly at 100 feet, 101 feet up to 400, you have to request that at least 24 hours in advance, because that request actually has to be reviewed by the controlling agency. So whoever air traffic controlling agency is for that airport or that area, they have to look at that and say, I can't give you 400 feet, you're going to get denied. Or if you apply for 101 feet, maybe they'll give it to you. But it does have to be reviewed by the controlling agency at that point. And that's kind of how the grid map works. And you'd be using that for any controlled airspace, or any controlled airspace that you need permission to fly in. Okay. All right, sorry, I went on a tangent there. That's kind of my life right there. Okay, so to illustrate how two airspace depictions match up, I've placed the aeronautical chart for Lake Tahoe next to the UAS facility map for the same area. All right, so in this example, it clearly shows that the Echo 2 area, indicated by the red shading, has a corresponding grid map, right? And that requires airspace authorization. The green shaded area is for Echo 4 extension, and we know the Echo 4 airspace because it's segregated from the Echo 2 airspace. So to fly in the Echo 2 airspace, you have to get authorization, but the Echo 4 airspace, it's not even noted on the UAS facility map. Okay. I do have a tendency to talk really fast. So, and I haven't looked to see if there's any questions, but I appreciate your time. I know that airspace I find it very interesting. I call that job security for my company, because nobody else wants to do it. But if you guys have any questions, happy to answer them. Let me give this back to Dominic for a second.
Absolutely, and thank you, Rita, for going through this. I think many people on the call are somewhat or vaguely familiar, or maybe even experts in Class E airspace, but when it comes to UAS, it's just so interesting to see how the rules are different, and how we as UAS operators have to look at certain types of airspace differently, and opposed to as we look at them as pilots. So I'm going to open up the floor here as well. Does anybody have questions for Rita? Please feel free to unmute yourself if you do, or use the comments section.
Wow, I'm going to take that as I did an amazing job and nobody has any questions about Class E airspace.
Did do an amazing job.
Right? Yeah.
Actually, a couple.
Yeah, you talked too soon, Rita.
Ah.
Hi, Rita. This is Shirley Phillips. Great job. You did do a great job. But I'd like to ask more of an opinion question, just from the last job that I had, we were working on a new collision avoidance system to potentially take the place of TCAS. And the idea was this system would allow lateral changes instead of just going up or down if there's a potential collision to accommodate UAS operations. Last I know, they just completely put a pause on it. And I just wondered if you have anything coming down the line to help both UAS operators and pilots of flying manned aircraft to have some kind of collision avoidance systems.
Oh man, we need a lot of coffee for that conversation. There is so much out there right now. I mean, I just watched a presentation on a UAS flying with LiDAR that can predict and move out of the way of different obstructions. I mean, obviously the closure rate was not something they discussed. It was more of a ground operation. They're doing amazing things with UAS technology, but they haven't gotten to the point where, that I've seen anyway, that they can do things to manned and unmanned aircraft. I have seen one that came out of MIT that was sonar based, which was really cool. But as far as unmanned aircraft, you have some issues. Like you have issues with weight, you have issues with interference, those kind of things that would limit the UAS technology in collision avoidance. And then on the other side, you have, like you said, the TCAS system is a little bit old, a little bit outdated, especially when it comes to collision avoidance with unmanned aircraft. But then you also have the difficulty with the FAA does not want drones to have ADS-B for many different reasons. I understand that. We do have a couple aircraft that have ADS-B on them because they fly in TFRs with firefighting aircraft. But transponders, it clutters up the airspace. ADS-B, they don't have the infrastructure to support it on UAS. So right now, one of the difficulties I'm actually trying to fix with our company, because we need waivers to do everything. One of the waivers I'm writing is to deconflict manned and unmanned aircraft at a Class G airport without using ADS-B, a transponder. The only thing they want me to use is visual acuity, which, I mean, we already talked about. It's really hard to determine, altitude and vector and attitude when you're standing on the ground. It's hard to do it in the air, so it's hard to do it on the ground. Right. So like I said, I could talk all day about that. I'm not going to talk about it right now, but I'm happy to have that conversation. And that's really interesting that you worked on that project. But there's so many different things going on in the unmanned aircraft world that nobody's quite figured it out yet.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I was kind of looking to see what your perspective was and what's out there now. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks, Shirley. And there are a couple questions in the comments section. So a few people have asked, is this presentation being recorded? Yes, it is. And the plan right now is that it will be uploaded sometime over the weekend or early next week. For those of you who would like to review it, we'll just put it up on YouTube. A question from Charmaine is, what unique regulations make our U.S. airspace the safest in the world? In your opinion, Rita?
In my opinion,
I have my
I do
own.
not. Oh, you do? Okay, let's compare. Well, I was going to say infrastructure, but our infrastructure is so old as far as navigational aids and that kind of thing. But I think, man, that's hard because I don't want to be wrong here. In my opinion, I would say that the training that the air traffic has to go through in order to become, certified as an air traffic controller and work at center approach, all that kind of stuff. So the training is pretty intense. And I don't know, that's what I would probably go with at this point. I have a lot of respect for air traffic controllers, so maybe that's diluting my opinion.
Yeah. If you don't have a button in here real quick too, I mean, I think the 107 regulatory body as an entity was very smart. And obviously, there's a lot of sections of it that really sort of mimic Part 91 or expand on it. But when you look at what's happening elsewhere in the world with, flying unmanned aerial systems in less regulated airspace, it's really more of an experiment, right? Where say over in like South Africa where they do crop monitoring, or maybe other places that you have experience with, Rita, at least it seems from a spectator view that those are the real those are the real testing grounds for long range, non-domestic UAS operations. And then we here are setting up 107 and the testing through NASA, the FAA, and other government bodies as a way to ensure what you just said earlier, that this still remains the safest airspace in the entire world. So I would say 107 adds to that. In addition to that, for the manned folks here, 91-213, inoperative equipment and deferring inoperative equipment probably makes us the safest airspace in the world because disallows people flying around with inoperative equipment. Unless they
I would definitely agree with you there. I was thinking about airspace in general and air traffic controlling it as being safest, but the regulations that have come out of basically all our regulations have come out of accidents, right? So all of the regulations that have come out of that is why it's the safest in the world, because you don't have aircraft falling out of the sky. You touched on Part 107 a little bit, and I do want to expand on that, because Part 107 is okay, in my opinion, from a safety standpoint, from a risk standpoint, which is one of the other things Daniel Webster trained me very well. We got trained by Navy pilots. We know what risk and mitigation is, right? So one of the things that I do find lacking in Part 107, in my opinion, is a lot of the other countries that have pretty robust UAS operations, they require, it's not just a test you have to take, you actually have to demonstrate proficiency in your aircraft. You have to have an operating manual. You have to have a somewhat of a maintenance program to go along with it. There's a lot more that kind of mimics our normal manned operation regulations in other countries. We're not doing that yet, which is really surprising to me. UAS operators just have to take a knowledge-based test, and then you have to take it every 2 years. To me, from a safety standpoint, I don't think that's sufficient enough. But again, that's my opinion. I'm not the only one with that opinion, but I think that we could be doing more from a commercial aviation side of UAS that could make it much more safe.
Very well said. So there's a few more in here, and the chat box is blowing up over here, which is really nice. So I think we talked about this a little bit through Shirley's question, but in case it requires some expansion, someone asked, does recreational UAS now require position or anti-collision lights?
No.
Yeah.
But I do want to touch on recreational. So welcome to Rita's conversation on UAS. I'm totally going off topic. But I want to point out that the AMA guys, the Academy for Model Aeronautics, they've been doing this for 60 years. They are some of the best UAS operators, because technically they're a UAS, they're an unmanned system, and that's how the FAA has now defined them. They're some of the best operators I've ever seen in my life. And they've been doing this, again, for 50, 60 years, and they've been doing it safely, completely under the radar, pardon the pun. But now with all of the commercial UAS operations, they're kind of getting lumped in. And some of them are, having a bad rap of, those, the recreational operators. I'm like, there's a difference between like the AMA guys, and I say guys, but the AMA operators who have been doing this forever, and they have a pretty robust, safety program and membership and education programs and all this kind of stuff. And then there's the people who just want to fly in their backyard that don't know that they're even regulated. So there's a big difference when people talk about recreational operators. They tend to lump them all into one category, and I tend to try to separate them out because there are a huge number of recreational operators that are doing things very, very safely, and they're doing it correctly and under the regulations. And then you have this other group that unfortunately doesn't know about the regulations, or they don't care. And that's kind of our problem child right now, I think, in the UAS industry.
And then the next one, someone actually asked, is the PowerPoint available in PDF format? I have a couple of colleagues that weren't able to participate, and they'd like to share this with them.
Yeah, I can do that. Sure. Just send me an email, and I'll do that. Do you want me to put my email address in the chat here? Hold on.
I think that'd actually be great, Rita, if you don't mind.
Okay, hold on. I'm going to stop share. All right. Bear with me.
Sure.
Okay. To everyone. Did I spell it right? You got to check. Here we go. All right.
There you go. That looks good.
Okay. You want me to read these, or do you want to read them?
Oh, I could still moderate for if you'd like.
Okay, go ahead.
So I wasn't sure if you could see it on your side. So Mike Sorson asked, what is your workflow for planning a UAS flight? He generally starts with weather, air map, and sky vector for sectionals. Is there anything he's missing?
Our workflow is very much like manned aircraft workflow. So we do a kind of a preliminary proposal looking at airspace, obstructions, who the customer is. We do initial site survey using Google, especially because you can use the Google profile to see what the ground is doing, right? And then I don't want to promote anybody, but I usually use AirMap for my authorization requests. Weather, yeah, everything that's usually in a manned aircraft pre-planning or pre-flight, that's basically what we do as well. We just do it on a very much smaller scale, which is kind of fun because when we check weather, we don't have to check weather across the country to see what front's coming across and what we're going to fly through. We have micro weather. As long as it's good in our little area here for the next 3 hours, we're good to go.
Great. And then Raymond asked, can we assume that E to surface, so Class E airspace to surface when a Delta Tower is closed is E2? And can you review the differences between Echo 3 and Echo 4 airspace again?
I know, I talk really fast. I just saw a tiny bit slower. So E3 and E4, you do not need FAA air traffic authorization to fly in. E3 and E4 are segmented from the airspace. They are an extension to the airspace. The E2 is the one that you need the airspace authorization, and there's no segmenting the airspace. It's all one weird shape. Is that better? So E3 and E4 are pretty much the same thing. They're just different. They're different for Class Delta and Class Charlie airspace. That's really they're really the same kind of thing when it comes to UAS operations. Can you assume that E to the surface when a D tower is closed is E2? Yes. That's a really good question, and I'm leaning towards yes, and anybody else as an aerospace person can weigh in on this, but I can actually check that for you. So if you send me an email, I'll ask that question. I'm pretty sure. Plus D to the surface, E2. Yeah, that would make sense.
And then Tom actually says, thank you for mentioning the Sorry, I'm tongue-tied. The Academy of Model Aeronautics and the Community-Based Safety Program for Model Aircraft Operations. They're hoping the RID rulemaking accommodates the proven safety record for visual-only model operations. I can't agree more with that. It's really exciting to see these things develop. And I'd love to hear your commentary on it too, Rita.
For what? Oh, hoping the RID rulemaking.
Yeah.
I don't have enough information yet. There's all these ideas that are popping up and around, but I haven't seen anything actually come through as an actual proposal of what we're going to do. To me, it's all been very theoretical. Great idea in theory. I know some companies that are working on it, but I haven't seen it work yet. And maybe that's just, I haven't seen it yet, but I don't have a comment because I haven't seen it in reality working yet. So if anybody, I mean, if you want to send me something, I'd be happy to look at it.
Great. And then Greg from the University of Maine Augusta says, a great comment on weather. The weather for UAS is more important. I would guess as surface winds at low altitude. Are there any special tools you use for low level winds?
Oh man, I have some great stories on UAS and winds, because you're absolutely right. The surface winds, I mean, 8 to 10 knots, you're like, ooh, looking at some of the foam trainers that we have, 8 to 10 knots of wind they blow those things around, right? So usually our tools are the visual ones. So I'm looking at the trees. Some of the fields that we fly at, we actually have a little windsock set up in different areas. But the trees, and then, you know, we're feeling it. A lot of us have been doing this a really long time, so we're used to the winds. But one tool I really like is called Windy. I don't know if you've ever used that, but Windy is a really nice app. It was actually developed for windsurfers. So they have really good data, and they pull data from all different sources. So it kind of averages it out a little bit, because as we know, we can look at one weather source and they're telling me it's raining, and the other one tells me it's sunny. I was like, all right, guys, can we, you know, split the difference here? So I do like Windy for low level winds. It's been pretty helpful.
Great. And then,
yeah, the anemometer. We do have one of those as well. Yeah. And actually, some of the new platforms that we have, some of the new flight planning that we have, actually gives us the winds based on, because we have little pitot tubes on our aircraft. So it will do the calculation for us of, you know, where the winds are coming from and the velocity based on our track over the ground. So that's been really helpful too. We really like that. I was like, oh wow, I feel like I'm, you know, flying a PC-12 again. It's giving me my winds and where they're coming from. It's great.
And we haven't heard anybody unmute yet. Is there anybody else that has any questions they'd like to ask Rita? I'm loving this conversation. I do hope to keep it going. There's a lot of new unknowns at the UAS, right?
Yeah.
Transitioning from manned flight to UAS. So what other questions does the group have for Rita?
Hello, this is Wyatt from UMA. I just had a quick, I guess, comment and question. I was surprised by the UAS facility map and how, I guess, useful that was. And where would you access that information? Is that on an app that you use?
There are plenty of apps, but here I will put a PDF, or I'll put a link to the PDFs. Hold on, stand by one. All right. Boop. There you go. And you just click on one of the links below, and it'll take you to either different types of the facility map, but they're all basically the same.
All right, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. That was an easy question. I like those, so you can bring more of those. Oh, you're muted. Are you talking?
Yeah, sorry, it happens. I'm always interested in the weight limitations on UAS, and I know you and I have had this conversation before, but I'm not sure. Has anything changed with the waiver requirements for anything over 55 pounds or that approval process, or do we anticipate anything to change with that? Because
yeah. So the waiver process for anything over 55 pounds, and this is where the industry is moving way faster than the federal regulations, right? Which is very common. But the UAS industry is moving way faster, and people want UAS that will, take off vertically, transition a forward flight, fly for 12 hours, carry a 12 kilogram payload, all this stuff that's completely impossible right now because, well, one, because of batteries and weight, but that's a different subject, but also because in order to operate in that category, you have to be 55 pounds and up, right? And that is a completely unregulated field right now. So instead of, since we don't have anything, you basically have to cram your UAS into Part 91 regulations, which obviously is not possible. So you have to get waivers for everything. They had what they call a Section 44807 waiver. And that is so like, for example, we have a UAS that's 75 pounds, right? We fly it for fire monitoring. We fly it in a TFR, so we have permission to fly it there. Or we fly at a UAS test range, but we can't fly it locally. So we apply for a weight waiver. Now, the weight waiver is so old. The process is so old. It has to go through, I think it's like 18 or 19 people have to touch this waiver. People have to touch this waiver in order for it to get approved. My waiver for weight has been in since January. So, and I still have no idea where it is in the process. And if you call the FAA, bless the FAA, I'm not bad mouthing the FAA, but if you call the FAA, this process is so old that they don't even know where it's at. Do you know what I mean? Like because not a lot of people apply for it. It's not something that's really well tracked. So they don't even know who has my waiver right now. They're trying to change that. They're trying to go with more of a durability and reliability testing program. So if you can not make any modifications to your platform and you can fly it safely for 350 hours, 350 hours, by the way, is a lot in a drone, by the way, a lot, especially when your flights are normally like, 20 to 30 minutes. So this is really for aircraft that are, long endurance, high altitude, long endurance. But they're trying to go into that direction, but they're still not even there yet. They still don't have that process approved. So anything over 55 pounds is, it's just a lot of back and forth calling, figuring out what's happening, what kind of, how do you mitigate risk of the weight of flying in this area? If it, hits some, it's a lot, but it's hopefully, I haven't heard of anything moving forward with the FAA as far as, operating over 55 pounds at this point in time, as far as like regulating another category. So maybe up to like 120 pounds or something. I know that they were talking about it, but I haven't seen anything come through as far as a working group or notice of proposed rulemaking or anything like that. So we're kind of stuck with some antiquated processes if you're 55 pounds and up, which is pretty hard because the industry is basically demanding that your aircraft is going to be over 55 pounds at this point.
Thank you. And what other questions do we have for Rita? I know there's more. Well, great. Thank you, Rita.
You're welcome. Everyone wants to go to lunch. They want to go to an early lunch. It's Friday.
Yeah. And thank you so much for doing this presentation for us again, Rita, today. This really helps, I think, of a lot of us UAS transitionees, if I can say that, really understand how this type of airspace affects our operations. And again, if anyone's looking for MBAA CAM credit or FAA Wings credit, please email us at snusafety@snu.edu with the courses you've attended and what kind of credit you'd like to get. We'll take care of that for you. And again, Rita, thank you so much for doing this today. We will be reconvening at 12:30. During that 12:30 time, we'll have Rob O'Donnell from the U.S. Coast Guard, who's also a Tufts PhD candidate in human factors, talking about human factors in flight. So we hope to see you there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rita.
Thanks, Rita.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye, everybody.